Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm with Peak Performers. I want to welcome you back to My Disability Story. This is a article series that I have started in order to interview people within the world that have disabilities, because oftentimes when I'm out there in the world engaging with individuals, they tell me, Miles, I feel so alone. I feel like there's nobody else out there that's like me. Well, that's not true. There are 26% of Americans have a disability of some way, shape, or form, and it's my personal mission to highlight their lived experiences. So I am so excited to welcome to the show Ryan Honick today. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Miles. I really appreciate the opportunity and the fact that you reached out and that we're here to have this conversation.
And Ryan, we met by sheer circumstance. I was doing an event up in Washington D.C. area. You weren't able to attend, but we had a fantastic conversation in the over the phone while I was sitting in a parking lot. And I just remember being so impacted by your story because I've been following you for so many years on LinkedIn. So tell me a little bit more about kind of how you got involved within the LinkedIn platform and what kind of advocacy you're trying to push for.
I consider it, very happenstance that LinkedIn was the platform that gave my advocacy uh, a boost. I've always considered myself an advocate for disability. I think it's very natural for me when you're moving around and through the world that we have a tendency to take for granted how the world is built for people um, that don't have disabilities, and then suddenly when you either because you acquire one or because there's congenitally, um, I think you discover very quickly that the world is not built for that. And for me, it just became a natural evolution of realizing just how, and all this dates back from education, um, through my work experience and my life as an adult, how that lens has evolved. The more I observed, the more I experienced, the more frustrated I guess I became. Um, and LinkedIn sort of became a natural outlet, as did Twitter for a while. I chronicled a lot of my access issues on and through Twitter. LinkedIn reached out to me and said, "Hey, your advocacy is gaining a lot of attention. We're going to bestow upon you it's their equivalent of like the verified badge for like influencers," which was very surprising to me. Uh, I think, speaking for myself, but I think for a lot of advocates, we don't do it for the notoriety and the accolades. We're doing it because our life needs access, and the fact that it's getting a platform and attention is a bonus.
I think that it's important to point out that we're actually filming today on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, or GAD, and that celebrates more digital accessibility within the world too. But do you describe for me maybe some of the different accessibility challenges that you have encountered, and how the world might be inaccessible to you at different times?
From a digital standpoint, I leverage a lot of assistive tech, right? So I'm very aware of how assistive tech can access. For myself, that counts everything from speech to text, which we all use in our phones now. A lot of us. Anytime that you're using your iPhone and you're doing speech to text, that's one example that I use every single day. As I'm working with my own computer and my own audio setup, there's so much that I'm dictating um, into my devices and then getting transcripts for all of that. And it's an educational moment for me to, when I talk to folks about things that they don't necessarily think about as assistive tech, because it's become so mainstream that people don't think of it as this started really as an accessibility need for so many people in the disability space, and then suddenly, as it becomes more mainstream, people don't think about where it started. The classic example of that, it's not necessarily a digital accessible, for GAD, for example, but the curb cut effect commonly, right? Um, Something that was designed for folks with disabilities, but everybody uses it. And the same, I think, can be applied for assistive technology and ways to help people communicate effectively. But in terms of access in general, there's tons of things.
Just to elaborate on your point there too, for viewers that might be unfamiliar with the term curb cut effect, curb cut effect refers to a phenomenon that happened where a couple decades back, it became a requirement to add cuts into curbs that would allow somebody using a wheelchair, for example, to be able to get up onto a sidewalk curb. These were not there before, and what happened along the way is that many other people within the community discovered that it was useful for them too, and you might use it to this day. So imagine that you're pushing a heavy shopping cart or a baby carriage, and just how difficult it would be to navigate up onto that sidewalk curb if you did not have that ramp built into it. So within the accessibility world, we often talk about this effect, and like Ryan says, there is wide-ranging impacts that anytime that you implement some kind of accessibility measure, you help many other people who also happen to be impacted or who also might stand to benefit from this as well.
And as you were doing that, I thought about another common one that applies here as well. It's closed caption, right? Designed for folks that are deaf and hard of hearing. But I know for myself, I keep them on because sometimes what I've noticed is there are things that the caption provides in terms of I'm watching a show and there's some background events or things that are happening or that aren't as audible, and then suddenly I'm picking up on nuances from what I'm watching that I would have likely missed had I not had them on.
And that's an incredible example because it's estimated that 50% of Americans right now actually regularly watch television with some level of closed captioning or subtitles on. And it is not your imagination. The actual voices of actors have been trained more over the years to mumble in their acting to make it more realistic. But the effects of that is that many people with moderate hearing loss, or many people that just might struggle to hear what they're saying because they don't have a perfect audio system, just struggle with that.
I'm thinking a lot about when I create digital content. So many people, just because you're in a public space, for example, and you may or may not have headphones with you for whatever reason, but you still want to be able to watch the content. Captions are great for that.
I want to talk a little bit more about you personally, Ryan, and particularly the name of the show is My Disability Story, where I seek to tell the stories because, again, 26% of Americans have a disability, but many of them feel completely alone in their experience. So if you don't mind me asking, like, what is your disability or disabilities, and how has it impacted your life and your career?
I have multiple, but the underlying one is cerebral palsy. And then from that stem some other things that sort of come with that, but are treated separately. So some vision challenges, and I have some chronic pain, which is independent of all of that. But a bunch of things as I've aged, as my body has gotten older, things have manifested. And that's the other thing about disability too, that I think a lot of people don't always think about. It's the one group that you can join at any time. And I always like to playfully tell people, you have the disabled population, and then if you look at the other side of it, you are pre-disabled, and that's to say, I chuckle. It makes me think of like a mafia threat. But if you live long enough, you will become disabled. If you're fortunate enough to live long enough, your body will age. You will acquire some form of disability. It may be small, it may be minor, or it may be something bigger that happens as you age. But it is the one group that you can join at any time, and so it's a viewpoint that I don't particularly like to highlight in the context of why people should care about access, but it is something that does tend to resonate with people more.
And something that I would point out too, that this is a lot of times we've thought about disability from the perspective of pity, of, oh, that poor person that has a disability over there. But what people fail to connect the dots on is that Very likely there are people immediately within your sphere or even you that have a disability, and that's okay. It's part of the human experience, it's part of the lived experience. And quite frankly, over the last 100 years, on average, we've gained 30% more lifespan. And with more life comes more. Things that happen, and that's part of the blessing of having a longer life. It does not make anybody less than or somebody to feel sorry for.
I became, as I got older and more into advocacy and more comfortable with my own lived experience, I became hyper aware of the language used around disability. And I think we've shied away from this by and large, although I still see it sometimes. Journalists who write about disability, and they'll use the phrase, so and so suffers from,
Hmm.
right? That automatically puts the frame of disability as an inherent negative. They're suffering with, or suffering from, and the flip of that to say it more constructively is so and so lives with the disability. Another linguistic sort of pet peeve of mine is the phrase confined to a wheelchair. For a lot of people with disability, a wheelchair is freedom, right? I have a lot of mobility outside of my chair. Not, again, not everybody does, but a good percentage of folks who are wheelchair users have some mobility outside of their chair. But from a access standpoint, from a freedom standpoint, from a stress on my body standpoint, I feel much safer in my chair. Without my chair, I would actually be more limited because I'm dealing with my body and not feeling as safe to be mobile, right? So for me, a wheelchair is freedom. I think a lot of wheelchair users would say that. When my wheelchair is broken or needs to be repaired, that's when I feel the most confined, is when I don't have it.
Now, Ryan, I've never shopped for a wheelchair before. Could you describe to me that process of like how you go about finding a wheelchair, what you're looking for, and maybe what some people get wrong about the wheelchair using community?
Because every wheelchair user has such a different experience. What they need is different. I can tell you that for me, I have a fantastic medical team that goes from everything from the doctors who write the prescriptions and helping me deal with insurance, and insurance is a whole different conversation that's less friendly to this process. It's everything from the folks who help sort of measure and fit my chair. My chair is custom fit for my body weight and configuration, how I sit, how I need to posture, how I navigate, and so it's very configured. I have a manual chair with what's called power assist wheels, so I can touch the rim, and then from that little bit of pressure, my wheels will move. For me, it's a good compromise between full manual chair and a sort of full on power chair. But it absolutely enables me to navigate the city with a lot of ease, and especially with my service dog, who I just got. I'm on my service dog. Her name is Lovey. She is the successor to Pico, who I had for 11 years, and Lovey and I got matched just over. You and I spoke just before I went to team training for Canine Companions up in New York, up in Medford, and I just came back with her. So she and I are freshly minted, as it were. She went through 9 months of training with the organization, and now she and I are getting to know each other slowly.
Could you describe to me why different people within the disability community may use a service animal and what the training looks like for those animals?
Sure. And again, I speak from my experience with canine companions, who I have absolutely amazing things to say. Again, they matched me with my first service dog, who I worked with for 11 years, and now Lovey is his successor. That process to me is so enriching. They work with, again, these dogs for about 6 to 9 months, and by the way, this is after volunteers puppy raise them for about the first 18 months, and that's out of their own pocket, their own time, their own energy, their own everything. And then from there, they work on sort of what you would want your sort of basic house trained dog to do, right? Um, so basic obedience, and then after about 18 months, they turn them over to the region. In this case, for me, it's the Northeast. They turn them over to the Northeast region up in New York, and those professional training staff and team work with these guys for about 9 months, 6 to 9 months, depending on where they are in their training journey. And then they call me. And granted, I've also, I've had to apply, so I'm in their system now, right? For successors, it's about a 2-year wait right now. So I actually did my successor application while Pico was retired and just enjoying his last go around, last couple years. I did my application in the middle of that, and then he passed away in October, and then I got the phone call for team training, is what they call it, up in Medford, and that's where you spend 2 weeks under the watchful eye of trainers and instructors and staff who not only know these dogs they've been working with for up to 9 months, but they also know particularly the applicants like myself who are on successor dogs. There's also always a class of new folks as well. So they are new to the organization, but the organization knows successor candidates really well, and so they know my application, they know my background, they know what I'm looking for. And this team is amazing because they know these dogs, and then they say, okay, we go there for 2 weeks and we do what's called rotation. And that's 1 day of working with a handful of the dogs, not all of them. I think our class had 10, and we work with in rotation on day 1 with a handful of them each. But then the second day, which is Tuesday, so we've only been there for 24 hours, and by Tuesday morning, the staff has already said, we think we know which dog is best for you, and you spend the next 2 weeks learning them, learning the process, learning how to incorporate the new training procedures that they've done to effectively bond with your dog. And it is an incredible process to watch, and the bond that gets created over those 2 weeks. These trainers and staff really understand how to do that effectively, and I'm incredibly grateful.
And how does your dog help you to be able to engage with and interact and navigate the world?
Lovey is trained, as was Pico, in about 50 different commands. I think that's their arsenal. And that's everything from opening doors and drawers to turning light switches on and off to picking up items that I've dropped, which is an incredible saver on my body because I'm not bending as much. I'm not putting as much stress if I drop something. I drop my keys. And then also within that, like for example, with picking up dropped items, she has about 4 or 5 different ways that she can then deliver them to me. So if I drop my keys, she can come up directly onto my foot plate. She can come up on the side of my lap and deliver. On either side, she can also come up directly further than my foot plate. If I need her to be higher, she can come up directly to my chest. And then there's sort of directional navigation of where do I want her as we're working. Do I want her my left, my right, my front, back? It depends on what we're navigating in public. So that kind of work is very rewarding to watch, and it's fun to sort of build that bond with her from the ground up as I'm doing this for the second time.
For those viewers that are not super familiar with service animals, there are so many different kinds of service animals out there, but also it's important to point out too that they are not a pet. They are a companion, but they also help you to be able to navigate the world. Am I kind of summarizing that correctly?
The public is both incredibly curious and sometimes incredibly unfamiliar with service dogs, and that can create some chaos as we are navigating space. For example, being home now for just under a week, I'm working a lot with Lovey in how to get familiar with the space that she's in, and so we're basically having mini training sessions out in public, if that makes sense. I'm getting her familiar with things I need her to do in public. Then you have, on the flip side of that, a very curious public that sees all of this and wants to interact and ask questions, and I'm always happy to do that, but not at every turn at like 7 in the morning when all I want is my coffee, right? For example, like let me get my coffee in my system and then I will engage with you. Um, so just having that space to breathe a little bit is really helpful right now. But in general, I think service dog teams appreciate an engaged public, but also understanding the boundaries of like letting us work. When you're working with a service dog and elevators, we have a very specific choreography that we have to do it safely, right? Where Lovey will go out in front of me, she will turn around, I will back her in, and then I will rotate. So it's very choreographed. Just within the week or so that I've been home, there are folks who will see us wait for an elevator, and then there'll be like 3 or 4 people in there, and they'll say, "Oh no, there's plenty of room," and they will insist that I join them and that there's plenty of room and that I'm misjudging the situation. But I'm thinking about it from the standpoint of a handler. I'm looking at where I am at first, where I need to go, how I need to go there, and where I will end up.
I wanted to circle back a little bit to exploring a little bit more exactly what is cerebral palsy for those of the listeners that are unfamiliar with it. And moreover, how does it impact you and your career?
So it is a spectrum, a wide range of how it can appear for everyone. So my version of it looks very different than somebody else's. But it can be, and so I'll speak for myself because that's really the only experience I have. But for myself, what it means is I have a inherently weaker left side of my body. My muscle strength is primarily on my right side, so I have an inherent weakness on my left leg, left hand. Fine motor coordination is more impacted on that side, and then balance and coordination is impacted a lot, which is why I prefer to sit and navigate in my wheelchair, hence the freedom, right? We were talking before about the wheelchair and sort of the language around it and how I find it freeing. Part of that is because with cerebral palsy, if I'm out walking and I have a very familiar gait pattern for people that have CP. It looks very familiar to people who know it. But it can also lead to a lot of uncertainty in the public because I'm navigating, let's say, on my feet, and the public doesn't necessarily know what to do with that. Am I going to fall over? Am I going to be where am I going necessarily? I'm trying to look where my feet are going. My brain has one idea, my feet have another idea. Like getting those things to coexist and cooperate are not great. And that creates a lot of confusion, I think, to people who see me on my feet sometimes, like, how do I help or how do I navigate? And I think having a wheelchair is a very universal sign for like, oh, he has equipment. This is how he navigates the world. I should create some space, right? And now I have the added benefit of navigating with Lovey, and she also creates a barrier in some way. But that's more universally understood, I think, publicly than how does somebody with CP who may have mobility outside of their chair. But from a standpoint of how does that impact my career, I think it's led to a lot of growth for me. I started working for the government about 15 years ago, straight out of grad school. I began work, and so I was still very early in my career federally, and the general workforce, and I being fresh out of grad school, not knowing how to balance my lived experience with disability with corporate life and where the boundaries were and where I could advocate and where I would face pushback. I knew that from the standpoint of academia. That's where I'd spent my life, and up through my mid-20s was purely academia. And so I understood the inherent biases and prejudice that came with that, and the need to advocate in an academic setting where things are much more, I think, prescribed. I found that getting into the workplace, I had to learn to navigate with much more nuance and understanding of corporate politics, of what it would mean for me to disclose this disability, although I can't really hide it. I had to learn how to appropriately bring certain things up in the context of not putting myself into a position where suddenly, and this happens a lot, this is where issues of disclosure tend to potentially cause a lot of anxiety for disabled people. Let's just say they've got an invisible disability. This is, I think, the way that this happens a lot. You have an invisible disability, and then you say to your employer, "Hey, I have ADHD, or I have some degree of something, autism, but hey, I need these workplace accommodations." But suddenly, you go from being viewed as a high performer potentially to, oh, well, now we have to do all of these accommodations that this employee is now asking for, and suddenly their ability to perform the job, even though they've been doing it, they've been performing well, that disclosure can create a misconception, I think, of what that particular employee can do, and suddenly they're having to defend themselves.
Why is it that you think that employers, when they realize that somebody has a disability, that they move them mentally in their mind from high performer to an other group?
Honestly, I don't know. Like, I wish that weren't the case, right? There's nothing that suggests that they should do that, especially if you've got a high performing employee, and they obviously did enough to interview and go through the standard process and do the things that they were required to do to get the job, and then suddenly you're asking for an accommodation, and that's met with a lot of potential pushback depending on how your employer views it. But as for why it happens, I think there's a misconception about maybe the cost of the accommodation, or perceived unfairness is a big one. If we do this for you, we have to do this for everybody, and that's not fair, right? But it's not. It's about leveling the playing field. I always say this. It's about leveling the playing field. It's not about this unfair advantage. Well, the Ryan got this. Why can't I get this? And if an employee with a disability tells you that they need an accommodation, believe them and help them get it. Because I promise you, no employee is disclosing because they think it's a perk, right? Given what we were just talking about, given the sort of stigma that goes with disclosure, no employee is disclosing thinking, great, now I'm going to get to do this, this great thing. I think about remote work a lot. I have the benefit of being a remote work employee. It's fantastic. Remote work is amazing. The pandemic, I think, normalized remote work, and now there's the return to office push. But what we're seeing with that is a bunch of folks who would otherwise be able to be employed with a disability. If your organization is now pushing for a return to office environment, suddenly you're with this disability, you may be wondering, can I keep my job? If I am now being mandatory return to office, and I've been operating on, especially if you were hired during the pandemic or you've always had some kind of accommodation, suddenly you may be at risk for needing to either negotiate with your employer or find new work. And so the gains that happened as a result of the pandemic are at risk for becoming undone as a result of the return to office mandates.
Could you speak a little bit more to why remote work as a job seeker accommodation is so beneficial for so many different people with disabilities?
I have chronic pain, so being able to manage that at home is a lot simpler than trying to manage that while I'm doing, I would have to do that, in the office. Even just getting remote, even getting from, if I had to go downtown to my office right now, like let's say 5 days a week, the return to office mandate, and I had to go into the office. Well, my office is in downtown DC. That commute would probably add maybe a little over an hour if everything goes my way between public transit. And then we're talking about stress on my body. Examples of like inclement weather is often a challenge too, right? If it's pouring rain and now I've got to navigate the DC Metro to get to my office, and I've got a service dog that, and I'm dealing with all these logistics, and then by the time I get to the office, I'm already exhausted, and then you want me to actually focus. If I would rather use my spoons and my energy to do my work. But I think being in the office creates this idea that suddenly you're more collaborative, and that you can only be most collaborative. That's the push that a lot of companies are using, is we need people in the office to be more collaborative. We were all collaborating just fine when the entire world was on lockdown. Nobody claimed we weren't being collaborative.
Working from home, as it cannot fix every accommodation need by any means, but it fixes an awful darn lot of them. And it's such a flexible and easy solution that helps out so many people that it is unfortunate that we have seen so much of this focus on RTO, especially in how it impacts many people with disabilities within our community. So tell me about some of the different projects that you have going on in your life, and tell me what's next for Ryan.
I am deeply entrenched in bonding with my new service dog. That's kind of the next focus for me in the next 6 months or so, is really cementing that bond with her. Of course, that will include continuing the advocacy that you alluded to earlier, and sort of the continuation of putting that out on a platform that I'm really grateful has enabled me to do it. LinkedIn obviously being the chief one. And so much of that, I attribute in part to, again, it was started by Pico. I feel like advocacy is, in my experience, a lot more likely to get attention when you're also attached to a really, really helpful dog, right? People then start to correlate like the amazingness of the service dogs to, oh, it's helping this human. And then suddenly it becomes not just about like disabled guy yells at cloud and gets angry at corporation. It's about creating a more accessible space for me, my service dog, any handler team. And it's a much broader message that I think resonates when you have something that a lot of people connect to, which is, oh, there's this dog and it's helping him too. And again, continuing that advocacy more broadly. And that's just it. And that's the challenge with advocacy, right? It's an amazing work. It's rewarding work. My dad always gave me this great line that I use constantly, which is, do your job so well that you put yourself out of business, right? That's always the goal. I'm glad to be a part of the mission, but it's also, as rewarding as it is, talk to any advocate. We're tired. We are tired, especially in the last few months, advocating for advocacy and things that are kind of rolling a little bit backwards right now.
Ryan, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I really admire your work, and you can find him, Ryan Honick, on LinkedIn. He is a top voice right there. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your lived experience with us. And this has been Myles from Peak Performers, signing off for now.